March 6, 1944. Debden Airfield, England. Colonel Donald Blakeslee watched as ground crews wrestled peculiar silver cylinders beneath the wings of his P-51 Mustangs. The tanks looked fragile, almost crude, with their wrinkled nose cones and ribbed construction. They felt impossibly light when empty, yet each would hold 108 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Traditional metal drop tanks weighed over 90 pounds empty. These British-made tanks weighed barely 40. They were constructed of kraft paper, impregnated with resorcinol glue, shaped over wooden forms like oversized papier-mâché children's projects. Most of Blakeslee's pilots had never seen anything like them. The mission briefing that morning had revealed something unprecedented. A red ribbon stretched across the wall map from Debden, across the English Channel, over occupied Europe, deep into Germany, ending at a single word printed in large black letters: Berlin. 1,100 miles round trip. No single-engine fighter had ever attempted such a distance. Hermann Göring himself had declared it impossible, had told Hitler that American fighters could never reach the Reich's capital. Today, Blakeslee's 4th Fighter Group would prove him catastrophically wrong. The mathematics of the mission depended entirely on fuel, capacity that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. The P-51B Mustang carried 184 gallons internally in wing tanks. 2 external drop tanks added another 216 gallons. Behind the pilot's seat, in a space that had previously held radio equipment, sat an 85-gallon fuselage tank that North American Aviation's engineers had retrofitted into production aircraft just months before. Total fuel capacity: 485 gallons. Enough, the planners calculated, to fly to Berlin, fight for 15 minutes over the target, and return home with a 30-minute reserve. The margin was thin. There would be no detours, no extended combat, no getting lost, and everything depended on those fragile paper tanks working exactly as promised. The journey from impossibility to this morning had begun not in American aircraft factories, but in the desperate calculations of Britain's Ministry of Aircraft Production in early 1943. By that point, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany was failing catastrophically. Without fighter escort, American B-17 and B-24 bombers were being slaughtered by German interceptors. On October 14, 1943, during a raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers out of 200, 91 dispatched, more than 600 men killed or captured in a single mission. Loss rates of 20% were unsustainable. The bombing campaign would collapse unless fighters could escort bombers deep into German airspace. The problem was simple mathematics. The P-47 Thunderbolt, America's frontline fighter in Europe, had an effective combat radius of approximately 450 miles, with external tanks. The P-38 Lightning could theoretically fly farther, but mechanical problems and insufficient numbers limited its usefulness. Neither aircraft could reach targets deep in Germany and return home safely. Britain's own Supermarine Spitfire, magnificent in air combat, had even shorter range. The RAF had abandoned daylight bombing entirely after suffering catastrophic losses in 1940 and 1941, switching to night raids that were less accurate but survivable. American doctrine insisted daylight precision bombing was essential. Without long-range escorts, that doctrine was killing hundreds of young men weekly. The P-51 Mustang had been conceived in April 1940 when the British Purchasing Commission asked North American Aviation to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. Dutch Kindleberger, North American's president, counter-proposed designing an entirely new fighter. His chief engineer, Edgar Schmude, delivered the prototype in just 117 days. The early Mustang had extraordinary aerodynamic efficiency. Its laminar flow wing design reduced drag dramatically compared to other fighters. But powered by the Allison V1000 710 engine, it performed poorly above 15,000 feet. The Allison lacked the sophisticated supercharger necessary for high-altitude combat, where German interceptors operated. The Royal Air Force used early Mustangs for low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack, roles where the Allison engine performed adequately. But as an escort fighter for high-altitude bomber formations, the aircraft was useless. The Germans simply climbed above 15,000 feet and waited, knowing the Mustangs couldn't follow effectively. The transformation began with a suggestion from Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronnie Harker. After flying a Mustang in April 1942, he immediately recognized that marrying the aircraft's exceptional airframe to Rolls-Royce's Merlin engine would create something revolutionary. The Merlin's two-stage, two-speed supercharger maintained power output above 30,000 feet. By October 1942, both the RAF and North American Aviation had independently tested Merlin-powered Mustang prototypes. The performance increase was staggering. Maximum speed jumped from 390 miles per hour to 440 miles per hour. Service ceiling increased from 31,000 feet to 41,000 feet. Most importantly, the aircraft now dominated at the high altitudes where bomber escorts fought. The Packard Motor Company was already producing Merlin engines under license for Britain. North American's Inglewood, California, facility began delivering P-51B models with Packard-built Merlin V16503 engines in May 1943. A second production line opened at North American's Dallas plant, building P-51Cs, which were identical except for their place of manufacture. But engine performance alone couldn't solve the escort problem. Even with the Merlin, the P-51B's combat radius with wing tanks only was approximately 470 miles. Berlin lay over 550 miles from English airfields. The aircraft needed dramatically more fuel capacity. External drop tanks provided the obvious solution. By carrying additional fuel in disposable tanks beneath the wings, fighters could extend their range significantly. When combat began, pilots jettisoned the empty tanks, restoring the aircraft's maneuverability and performance. The technology was well established. Japan had used drop tanks since the 1930s. Germany equipped Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters with external tanks. American fighters carried them routinely. The challenge was manufacturing enough tanks to support massive bomber escort operations while conserving critically scarce aluminum. Britain faced severe metal shortages by 1943. Every pound of aluminum was needed for aircraft structures, engines, and vital military equipment. Using scarce aluminum for single-use drop tanks that would be discarded over enemy territory seemed wasteful. German forces would recover the tanks and recycle the metal for their own war production. Engineers at Britain's Ministry of Aircraft Production considered alternatives. Could drop tanks be manufactured from non-strategic materials? Something abundant, cheap, and disposable. Something the Germans couldn't easily recycle into. Weapons? The Bowater Paper Company operated several large mills in England, producing newsprint and kraft paper for packaging. Their engineers understood paper's structural properties. Kraft paper, when laminated with resorcinol formaldehyde glue, created a remarkably strong composite material. The glue was waterproof, resistant to temperature extremes, and provided structural rigidity. Development began in late 1942 at Bowater's facility in Sittingbourne, Kent. The basic design was straightforward. 3 main components: a nose cone, a tail cone, and a cylindrical center section. Each component was shaped over wooden forms, using layers of kraft paper impregnated with resin. The center section used the simplest construction. Workers wrapped paper strips around cylindrical forms, building up layers until the walls reached approximately 1/4 inch thickness. The nose and tail cones required more complex hand lamination, with petal-shaped pieces called gores overlapping to form rounded shapes. After curing, the 3 sections were joined with additional paper and glue. Fuel fittings, mounting brackets, and a filler cap were installed. The completed tank received a coating of silver-colored dope for weatherproofing and protection against the solvent effects of aviation gasoline. The construction method was labor-intensive, but required minimal skilled workers. Women, teenagers, and men too old for military service could be trained quickly. Production could scale rapidly without competing for resources needed elsewhere in the war economy. Testing revealed both promise and limitations. The paper tanks were astonishingly light, weighing approximately 42 pounds empty compared to 93 pounds for equivalent aluminum tanks. They could withstand the aerodynamic loads of high-speed flight and the temperature extremes of high altitude. They were waterproof and, initially at least, fuel-tight. But the glue slowly dissolved when exposed to aviation gasoline. A paper tank filled with fuel would begin developing leaks within 4 to 6 hours. This made them strictly single-use items. Tanks had to be filled immediately before takeoff. If a mission was scrubbed, pilots were required to jettison their tanks at designated dump points rather than landing with them attached. The paper tanks also couldn't be landed safely if still attached. The landing impact could rupture the tank, spilling fuel near hot engine components. Standard procedure required dropping the tanks before returning to base, even if still full, if a mission aborted before reaching enemy territory. For the 8th Air Force's purposes, these limitations were acceptable. Drop tanks were expendable by design. Pilots routinely jettisoned them when entering combat. The paper tanks' lightweight meant less fuel was consumed, overcoming aerodynamic drag. Their low cost meant Britain could produce them in vast quantities without diverting aluminum from critical uses. By early 1944, British factories were producing paper drop tanks in multiple sizes. The most common for P-51 seconds was the 108-gallon cylindrical design, approximately 9 feet long and 2 feet in diameter. The distinctive silver dope finish and wrinkled end caps made them easily identifiable. Production estimates suggest British manufacturers produced over 13,000 paper drop tanks during the war. They equipped not just P-51 Mustangs, but also P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings. American factories continued producing aluminum tanks, but the paper versions became standard equipment for the 8th Air Force's long-range missions. Yet even with 2 external drop tanks, the P-51B still couldn't reach Berlin reliably. The fuel capacity was close, but not quite sufficient for the deep penetration missions required to destroy Germany's industrial capacity and aircraft production facilities. North American aviation's engineers had identified additional internal fuel capacity. The space behind the pilot's seat, previously occupied by radio equipment, could accommodate another fuel tank. In August 1943, North American fitted an 85-gallon tank into this location on a P-51B test aircraft. The modification dramatically increased range, but created a serious problem. With the fuselage tank full, the aircraft's center of gravity shifted dangerously rearward. The P-51B became unstable, difficult to control during takeoff and climb. Several test flights nearly ended in accidents as pilots struggled with the unfamiliar handling characteristics. North American's test pilots developed procedures to mitigate the problem. The fuselage tank had to be used first, burning that fuel during the initial cruise to enemy territory. Once the fuselage tank was empty, or nearly so, the center of gravity returned to normal. The aircraft handled properly again. This required careful fuel management. Pilots burned fuselage tank fuel first during the outbound leg. Next, they switched to external drop tanks, using that fuel during the cruise into German airspace. When German fighters appeared, they jettisoned the drop tanks and fought using fuel from the wing tanks. During the return flight, if any fuel remained in the fuselage tank, they could burn that before switching back to the wing tanks for landing. The procedures were complex and demanded constant attention. But they worked. Starting with P-51B7 and P-51C3 models in late 1943, the 85-gallon fuselage tank became standard equipment. Combined fuel capacity now totaled 485 gallons. Internal, 184 gallons in wing tanks, plus 85 gallons in the fuselage tank. External, 216 gallons in paper drop tanks. Combat radius exceeded 750 miles. Berlin was within reach. The first P-51 Mustangs arrived in England in November 1943. The 354th Fighter Group officially part of the 9th Air Force but immediately co-opted by the 8th, flew their first mission on December 1, 1943. It was a fighter sweep over France, testing the aircraft and training pilots. 5 days later, on December 5th, the 354th escorted bombers to Amiens. On December 11th, they reached Emden, 420 miles into Germany. On December 13th, they escorted bombers to Kiel, 490 miles each way. Each mission pushed deeper into territory previously beyond American fighter range. German pilots noticed immediately. The twin-engine Bf-110 and Me-410 Zerstörer heavy fighters that had torn into bomber formations with impunity now faced swift, deadly Mustangs that could follow them anywhere. The single-engine Bf-109 and few 190 fighters that had waited safely, beyond the range of P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds, found themselves hunted throughout German airspace. By February 1944, multiple P-51 groups equipped the 8th Air Force. The 357th Fighter Group received their Mustangs at the end of January. The 4th Fighter Group, Don Blakeslee's unit, converted from P-47 seconds to P-51 seconds on February 28. The pilots had less than a week to familiarize themselves with the new aircraft before flying combat missions. The first Berlin raid was scheduled for March 3, 1944. Bad weather forced cancellation. March 4th brought better conditions. Over 700 heavy bombers would attack targets in Berlin and surrounding areas. Over 800 fighters would provide escort, including P-51 seconds flying all the way to Berlin for the first time in history. Colonel Blakeslee's 4th Fighter Group received their P-51 seconds on February 28. Some pilots had less than an hour of familiarization time before the aircraft were declared operational. On March 4, just 4 days later, they would escort bombers to Berlin. The morning briefing on March 6 revealed the full scope of the mission. Multiple fighter groups would provide layered escort, P-47. Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings would escort bomber formations during the initial penetration into German airspace, then turn back when their fuel ran low. P-51 Mustangs would fly directly to Berlin, rendezvousing with the bombers over Brunswick or Hanover, approximately 200 miles from the T-Koza target. The Mustangs would escort the bombers during their attack on Berlin, then cover their withdrawal until other fighter groups could take over for the return to England. The P-51 seconds would be over enemy territory for approximately 4 hours. They would face the largest concentration of German fighters ever assembled to defend a single target. Berlin was the capital of the Third Reich. Hitler himself was there. Every fighter unit within range would be committed to its defense. Intelligence estimated 300 to 400 German fighters would engage. The Luftwaffe would throw everything at the bombers and at the Mustangs trying to protect them. The mission would prove whether long-range escort was truly possible, whether paper-drop tanks would hold fuel reliably during a 5-hour flight, whether pilots could manage the complex fuel system effectively while navigating, maintaining formation, and fighting, whether the P-51's range and performance could overcome the Luftwaffe's numerical advantage over their own capital. As dawn broke on March 6, ground crews completed final preparations. Fuel trucks topped off wing tanks, fuselage tanks, and the fragile paper-drop tanks. Armourers loaded ammunition belts. Mechanics performed final inspections. Pilots pulled on flight suits, grabbed parachutes, and walked toward their aircraft. The paper-drop tanks hung beneath each wing, silver and slightly wrinkled, looking almost too delicate for combat. But inside, each tank, 108 gallons of fuel waited to carry American fighters farther than they had ever flown before, to a city Hermann Goering had declared unreachable, to a battle that would determine whether strategic bombing could succeed. The engines roared to life. Don Blakeslee led his group into the air. The formation assembled, turned east, and climbed toward altitude. Behind them, other Mustang groups followed. Ahead, 550 miles distant, Berlin waited. The North Sea passed beneath them, grey and cold in the early morning light. Blakeslee's formation climbed, steadily, reaching 25,000 feet as they crossed the Dutch coast. Below, The occupied Netherlands spread out in a patchwork of fields and frozen canals. German radar stations had already detected them. Somewhere ahead, Luftwaffe fighter controllers were scrambling interceptors, calculating vectors, preparing the defense of Berlin. The fuel management began immediately. Pilots switched to their fuselage tanks, burning that unstable fuel first to restore proper center of gravity. The P-51Bs felt awkward during the initial climb, tail heavy and reluctant. But as the fuselage, tanks emptied, the handling improved. By the time they crossed into German airspace, the Mustangs responded crisply to control inputs. At the German border, pilots switched to external drop tanks. The paper tanks fed smoothly, their fuel flowing through standard fittings into the aircraft's fuel system. There were no leaks, no failures. The British engineers had solved the technical challenges. The tanks worked exactly as designed. The bomber stream appeared ahead, a massive formation of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators stretching for miles. The heavy bombers flew in tight combat boxes, each box comprising 18 to 21 aircraft flying close formation for mutual defensive fire. Multiple combat boxes formed larger formations called wings. Multiple wings formed an air division. Over 600 heavy bombers were heading toward Berlin that morning. The rendezvous went smoothly. P-51 groups positioned themselves above, ahead, and on the flanks of the bomber formations. The P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds that had escorted the bombers from England turned back, their fuel exhausted. For the next 200 miles, the Mustangs would be the only defense. The first German fighters appeared near Brunswick. Bf 109 seconds and FUVU 190 seconds, climbing from airfields scattered across northern Germany. They approached cautiously, assessing the escort strength. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned painful lessons about attacking bombers with strong fighter cover. They probed for weaknesses, looking for bomber formations that had become separated or fighter groups that had been drawn out of position. Blakeslee's tactical frequency crackled with position reports and warnings. Bogies, 11 o'clock high. 2 bandits, diving through. I've got 4 Huns at 3 o'clock, level. The Germans were testing them, forcing the Mustangs to respond, trying to fragment the escort. The discipline held. Fighter leaders kept their formations tight. Individual pilots resisted the temptation to chase single targets. The mission was escort, protect the bombers, shoot down any German fighter that threatened the bomber stream, but don't get drawn into individual dogfights far from the formations they were supposed to guard. 20 miles from Berlin, the German attacks intensified. Entire gruppen of fighters dove through the bomber formations, cannons blazing. The Fave 190 seconds came in fast. Their heavily armed and armored Sturmbock variants designed specifically to destroy heavy bombers. Each Fave 190A carried 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, enough firepower to obliterate a B-17 with a single well-aimed burst. The P-51 pilots dove to intercept. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group saw a Feld 190 closing on a crippled B-17 trailing smoke. He pushed his throttle forward, diving steeply to cut off the Germans' attack angle. At 400 yards, he opened fire. The 650 caliber machine guns, in the P-51's wings, converged on the FDU 190. Strikes sparkled along the German fighter's fuselage. The Focke-Wulf rolled violently and dove away, trailing smoke. Gentile didn't pursue. More German fighters were positioning for attack runs. He pulled back up to the bomber formation's altitude, rejoining his squadron. Below, the Fable 190 spun downward, trailing fire. Gentile would never know if it crashed or if the pilot recovered. There was no time to watch. The battle was everywhere. Over Berlin itself, the flak opened up. German anti-aircraft batteries fired continuously, filling the sky with black bursts of explosive shells. The bomber formations flew straight through it, holding their course as bombs fell away toward rail yards, factories, and government buildings. The explosions below raised columns of smoke thousands of feet high. German fighters pressed their attacks with desperate courage. They, knew what was at stake. This was their capital, their city. The Luftwaffe had been promised immunity for Berlin. Now American bombers were dropping explosives on the Reich Chancellery while Hitler watched from below. Every fighter pilot in the defense knew that if Berlin could be bombed with impunity, no target in Germany was safe. A Bf-109 flashed past Blakeslee's canopy, so close he could see the pilot's face. Both aircraft were traveling over 400 miles per hour in opposite directions. The closing speed was staggering. Blakeslee hauled his Mustang around, trying to reverse, onto the 109's tail, but the German had already disappeared into the chaos of swirling aircraft. Lieutenant John Godfrey spotted a formation of Bf-109 seconds, climbing to intercept bombers from below. He rolled his P-51 inverted and pulled through, diving nearly vertically. 150 miles per hour. 470. 490. The Merlin engine roared at full power, the airframe vibrating from the strain. Godfrey opened fire at 300 yards. His tracers reached out toward the lead Bf-109. Strikes appeared on the German fighter's wing route. Pieces flew off. The 109 rolled hard right, trying to evade, but Godfrey followed, his gun sight tracking the target. Another burst. More strikes. The Bf-109's engine exploded in a gout of flame. The aircraft pitched up violently, stalled, and fell away, spinning. Godfrey pulled out of his dive, the forces crushing him into his seat. His vision greyed at the edges from the acceleration. The P-51 groaned under the strain but held together. He climbed back toward the bombers, scanning for more threats. The fuel gauges were dropping steadily. The external drop tanks had been jettisoned when combat began. Now the Mustangs were burning fuel from their wing tanks, the precious gallons that had to carry them home. Every minute of combat, every high-speed maneuver, every full-power climb burned fuel at rates far exceeding normal cruise consumption. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Pilots monitored their gauges carefully, performing rapid mental calculations. Fuel remaining, distance to England, time over target. Some pilots would face agonizing decisions during the return flight. Help a crippled bomber under attack and risk running out of fuel yourself, or save your fuel and leave the bomber to its fate. After 20 minutes over Berlin, the bomber formations turned west, beginning their withdrawal. The fighter groups turned with them, maintaining their protective formations. Behind them, Berlin burned. Smoke from hundreds of fires rose into the stratosphere, visible for over 100 miles. The German attacks continued during the withdrawal. Luftwaffe fighters pressed hard, knowing the Americans would be low on fuel and desperate to get home. Every bomber shot down now was one that wouldn't return to bomb Germany again. Every fighter that ran out of fuel was one less escort for the next raid. 20 miles west of Berlin, a crippled B-17 fell behind its formation. 2 engines were dead, a third trailing smoke. The aircraft was losing. Altitude slowly but inevitably. German fighters circled like sharks, waiting for the stragglers to become separated enough to attack safely. 4 P-51 seconds from the 357th Fighter Group dropped back to escort the damaged bomber. They formed a protective box around it, flying slowly to match its reduced speed. Their own fuel situations were critical. Staying with the bomber meant they might not reach England. Abandoning it meant the 10 men aboard would almost certainly die. They stayed. When Favre 190 seconds attacked, the Mustangs engaged them, breaking up attack runs, forcing the Germans to evade rather than press home their firing passes. The running battle continued for 30 minutes. The B-17 limped westward, losing altitude gradually. The escorting Mustangs' fuel gauges showed needles approaching empty. Near the Dutch border, other P-51 groups arrived to relieve them. The 4 fighters from the 357th finally turned for home, their tanks nearly dry. They landed at the first British airfield they could find, wheels touching down with fuel gauges reading 0. The damaged B-17 made it to England and belly-landed in a field. All 10 crewmen survived. Across southern England, Mustangs returned throughout the afternoon. Some landed at their home bases. Others diverted to emergency fields, their fuel exhausted. A few ran dry over the English Channel, their pilots bailing out to be rescued by air-sea rescue launches. But the losses were remarkably light considering the depth of the penetration. The 4th Fighter Group lost 3 aircraft over Berlin, the 357th lost 2, the 363rd lost 11, mostly to weather-related accidents and disorientation rather than combat. In return, the P-51 groups claimed dozens of German fighters destroyed. More importantly, the bombers had reached Berlin, bombed their targets, and returned. The mission succeeded. In his headquarters beneath Berlin, Hermann Göring received reports of the raid with growing disbelief. American single-engine fighters over Berlin, the declaration he had made to Hitler that such a thing was impossible, had just been proven catastrophically wrong. According to testimony recorded after the war, Göring said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. Whether he actually spoke those exact words remains debated. But the sentiment was accurate. If American fighters could escort bombers to Berlin, they could escort them anywhere in Germany. The Luftwaffe could no longer wait safely beyond the range of escorts, ambushing unprotected bomber formations. Every target in the Reich was now vulnerable to daylight precision bombing. The strategic implications were enormous. Between March 3rd and March 9th, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched 5 major raids on Berlin. Over 3,000 heavy bomber sorties dropped thousands of tons of explosives on German industrial targets, transportation hubs, and aircraft factories. The P-51 Mustangs escorted them all the way. German aircraft production, already struggling under Allied bombing, took devastating hits. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, which had cost the 8th Air Force so dearly in October 1943, were finally destroyed in February and March 1944. With P-51 escort, the bombers could return repeatedly until targets were obliterated, rather than taking unsustainable losses on single unescorted missions. The Luftwaffe's fighter force began a death spiral from which it would never recover. German fighters were shot down faster than training schools could replace pilots. Fuel shortages meant new pilots received minimal training before being thrown into combat against experienced American and British pilots. The casualty rates were horrific. Kurt Bühligen, a German fighter ace who survived the war, later recalled the period after the P-51 seconds arrived. The pilots who came to us from the Eastern Front had no comprehension of what they were facing. These fellows simply had no real understanding of the Western Front. I don't remember anyone who came to us from the East who survived. The paper-drop tanks that had seemed so fragile proved remarkably reliable. Production continued throughout 1944 and into 1945. British factories produced different sizes for different missions. 75-gallon teardrop tanks for shorter-range missions, 108-gallon cylindrical tanks for Berlin raids, and even larger, 150-gallon tanks for extreme-range missions to targets in southern Germany and Austria. The tank's single-use nature, initially seen as a limitation, became an advantage. The British saved thousands of tons of aluminum. The Germans recovered jettisoned paper tanks by the hundreds, but couldn't recycle them into useful metal. Some German propaganda leaflets were distributed in areas where tanks were frequently jettisoned, explaining to civilians that the strange silver cylinders were fuel tanks, not bombs, and should not be feared. After the war, Vietnamese farmers would discover another use for American drop tanks jettisoned during that conflict. The cylindrical metal tanks, cut lengthwise, made excellent canoes for navigating rivers and rice paddies, but the paper tanks of World War II simply rotted away, returning to the earth without providing any benefit to the enemy. The 85-gallon fuselage tank became standard on all subsequent P-51 models. The P-51D, which entered service in mid-1944 with a bubble canopy and 6 machine guns, incorporated the fuselage tank from the beginning. Combined with drop tanks and the Merlin engine's efficiency, the P-51D had a combat radius exceeding 800 miles. This extraordinary range enabled operations that would have been impossible earlier in the war. In August 1944, P-51 seconds from bases in England escorted B-17 seconds to Poland, then flew onward to land at Soviet airfields. After resting and refueling, they escorted bombers on strikes into Eastern Europe before flying to Italy. From Italian bases, they escorted bombers back to England. These shuttle bombing missions covered thousands of miles. In the Pacific theater, P-51 seconds, based on Iwo Jima, escorted B-29 superfortresses to Japan starting in March 1945. The overwater distance from Iwo Jima to Tokyo was approximately 650 miles each way. Only the P-51's range made fighter escort possible. The presence of Mustangs over Japan's home islands had the same psychological impact as their appearance over Berlin had on Germany. The production statistics tell the story of the Mustang's dominance. North American aviation built over 15,000 P-51 seconds during the war. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 8th Air Force's 15 fighter groups flew Mustangs. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings that had borne the burden of escort duty in 1943 were reassigned to ground attack and shorter-range missions. P-51 Mustangs were credited with destroying nearly 5,000 German aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other Allied fighter type, in the European theatre. The 357th Fighter Group alone claimed over 600 victories. The 4th Fighter Group, Donald Blakeslee's unit, destroyed over 550 enemy aircraft. The casualty statistics reveal the Mustang's effectiveness. In October 1943, before long-range, escorts were available. The 8th Air Force lost 9.1% of bombers dispatched on missions. By February 1944, after the P-51 seconds arrived in numbers, the loss rate had fallen to 3.5%. The Germans were losing the war of attrition. Individual pilots achieved remarkable records flying Mustangs. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group scored 26.83 victories, making him the highest-scoring P-51 pilot. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group scored 22 victories. Dozens of pilots became aces, the 5-victory threshold that marked exceptional skill and success. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, flew P-51 seconds from bases in Italy, escorting 15th Air Force bombers. They painted their aircraft's tails bright red for identification, earning the nickname Red Tails. Flying over 600 bomber escort missions, they established an impressive record. While claims that they never lost a bomber are exaggerated, their loss rates were among the lowest of any escort group, and they destroyed over 100 enemy aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who commanded the 332nd, later became the first African-American general in the United States Air Force. The combat record established by the Tuskegee Airmen helped break down racial barriers in the American military, proving conclusively that black pilots could perform as effectively as any others when given proper training and equipment. The British contribution to the P-51's success deserves recognition. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine transformed the aircraft from a low-altitude reconnaissance plane into the war's premier fighter. The paper-drop tanks extended its range beyond what internal fuel alone could achieve. The combination of American airframe design, British engine technology, and British manufacturing innovation created the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back. Edgar Schmude, the P-51's chief designer, was himself a German immigrant who had fled Europe in the 1920s. His background gave him intimate knowledge of German design, philosophy, and engineering practices. He understood what the Luftwaffe's fighters could do and designed the Mustang specifically to exceed their capabilities. The laminar flow wing that gave the P-51 its exceptional aerodynamic efficiency was cutting-edge technology in 1940. The wing's shape maintained smooth airflow over a larger percentage of its surface than conventional wings, dramatically reducing drag. This translated directly into speed and range advantages that proved decisive in combat. The Packard Motor Company's production of Merlin engines under license demonstrated American manufacturing prowess. Packard delivered over 55,000 Merlin engines during the war, equipping not just P-51 seconds but also British aircraft, including Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Lancaster bombers. The engines were built to exacting specifications, maintaining Rolls-Royce's quality standards while achieving American production volumes. North American Aviation's production efficiency was equally impressive. The company delivered over 9,000 P-51Bs and P-51Cs from their Inglewood and Dallas plants. The more advanced P-51D model, with its bubble canopy and improved armament, entered production in mid-1944. North American eventually produced P-51Ds at a rate exceeding 500 per month. The cost efficiency was remarkable. A P-51D cost approximately $51,000 to produce in 1944. A P-47 Thunderbolt cost approximately $85,000. A P-38 Lightning cost approximately $97,000. The Mustang delivered superior range and comparable performance at 60% the cost of the alternatives. The human stories behind the statistics reveal the war's reality. Lieutenant William Overstreet of the 357th Fighter Group became legendary for pursuing a Bf-109 under the Eiffel Tower during a dogfight over Paris. The German pilot had flown beneath the tower, hoping anti-aircraft fire would down his pursuer. Overstreet followed, scoring hits that destroyed the German fighter. He named his P-51 Berlin Express in recognition of the missions his group flew to the German capital. First Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group achieved something extraordinary on October 7, 1944. Flying a P-51D, he shot down two Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters in a single engagement. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter. Catching one required perfect positioning and timing. Drew caught two during their landing approach, when they were slow and vulnerable, and destroyed both. Captain Chuck Yeager, who later became the first pilot to break the sound barrier, flew P-51 seconds with the 357th Fighter Group. On October 12, 1944, he shot down 5 German aircraft in a single mission, becoming an ace in a day. His wartime experience flying high-performance fighters prepared him for his later career as a test pilot. The P-51's service didn't end with World War II. The aircraft saw extensive combat during the Korean War, flying ground attack missions against North Korean and Chinese forces. Its long range allowed strikes deep into North Korea from bases in South Korea. While outclassed by jet fighters in air-to-air combat, the Mustang's reliability and payload capacity made it valuable for ground support throughout the conflict. Over 55 countries operated P-51 seconds after World War II. Many air forces used them into the 1960s and 70s. The last combat use of P-51 seconds was in 1984, when El Salvador and Honduras both flew Mustangs during border skirmishes. 40 years after the aircraft was designed, it was still capable of military operations. Today, hundreds of restored P-51 Mustangs still fly at airshows worldwide. The aircraft's distinctive profile, the sound of its Merlin engine, and its historical significance make it one of the most beloved warbirds. Aviation enthusiasts pay millions of dollars for restored examples. The knowledge that these aircraft escorted bombers to Berlin, helped defeat Nazi Germany, and changed the course of history adds immeasurable value beyond their mechanical sophistication. The long-term impact of the P-51 program extended beyond its direct military effectiveness. The aircraft demonstrated that industrial collaboration between nations could produce results exceeding what either nation could achieve alone. American manufacturing combining with British engine technology created the war's finest fighter, proving that Allied cooperation was more than political necessity, it was strategic advantage. The program also validated the importance of continuous improvement. The early Allison-powered Mustangs were adequate, but unexceptional. Rather than accepting mediocrity, engineers on both sides of the Atlantic worked to maximize the airframe's potential. The result transformed an average aircraft into a war winner. The lesson applied far beyond aviation. Existing designs can be revolutionized through systematic engineering improvement rather than requiring completely new development. The P-51 development timeline illustrated remarkable speed of innovation under wartime pressure. From initial design to first flight, 117 days. From Merlin engine retrofit to combat operations, 14 months. From first Berlin escort mission to Luftwaffe defeat, 10 months. When necessity demanded rapid development, American and British engineers delivered. This stood in stark contrast to German aircraft development during the same period. The Luftwaffe pursued numerous advanced designs, jet fighters, rocket interceptors, advanced bombers, but brought few into production before the war ended. The Germans sought perfection. The Allies sought adequate solutions produced in overwhelming numbers. Adequate. 1. The strategic bombing campaign's success, enabled by the P-51 Mustang, remains debated. Did destroying German industry shorten the war significantly? How many civilians died in the bombing raids? Were the resources devoted to strategic bombing better used elsewhere? Historians continue analyzing these questions. What remains undebatable is that the P-51 achieved its primary mission. It escorted bombers deep into German territory and brought them home. It destroyed German fighters by the thousands, both in air combat and on the ground. It dominated the skies over Europe from March 1944 until Germany's surrender in May 1945. It proved that strategic bombing with fighter escort was viable, validating a doctrine that had consumed enormous resources and cost tens of thousands of lives. The paper drop tanks that made Berlin missions possible represent ingenuity under constraint. Britain didn't have enough aluminum, so engineers found alternatives. The solution was lighter, cheaper, and just as effective as metal tanks. Sometimes limitations force innovations that prove superior to unconstrained designs. The mathematics of Allied victory in Europe can be traced through fuel capacity equations. 184 gallons in wing tanks, plus 85 gallons in fuselage tank, plus 216 gallons in external drop tanks, equals 485 gallons total, divided by 70. Gallons per hour at cruise power equals 6.9 hours of flight time. Multiply by cruising speed of 260 miles per hour equals 1,794 miles maximum range. Subtract 30% for combat maneuvering and reserves. 1,256 miles combat radius. Berlin from Debden, 550 miles. Round trip, 1,100 miles. Margin, 156 miles, approximately 36 minutes of fuel, 36 minutes. That margin, enabled by paper tanks and internal modifications, broke the Luftwaffe's back. 36 minutes meant pilots could fight over Berlin instead of turning back short of the target. 36 minutes meant bombers reached their objectives with fighter protection. 36 minutes changed the war's outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed, historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.